Today I'm going to show you how to complete your little snapshot Polaroid drawing. First, you want to convert your photo to a black and white version rather than color, since we're going to be completing this in graphite. Then you want to make sure you can set your picture up on a tablet or on a phone right off to the side of where you're working. If you're left-handed like me, you want this image on the right, but if you're right-handed, you want this image on the left. For my materials today, I'm going to be using a regular number 2 pencil for softer shading and a mechanical pencil for when I need a much finer, more detailed point. I've also got an eraser, that way I can lift up any mistakes I make, but also use that eraser to pull back out highlights as I draw. As I begin working, one of the things that I like about having this image on a screen, like a phone screen or a tablet screen, is that I can really zoom in and move my image around to where I can see the detail really large on the screen. Once I get started, I'm going to begin with just the very simple contour drawings, just the outline edge of things, and I'm going to look very carefully to see where lines begin and end in reference to the outer square edge of each one of those boxes. So again, thinking about where the halfway point is on those boxes and then the fourth point on those boxes is going to help me find some of those intersection points to make sure that my drawing is nice and accurate. Another really important thing to think about is where the very center of the square is and where the object you're drawing falls in relationship to the center of each one of those squares. Notice I like to actually physically trace that shape out over top of my screen to help me visualize that before I draw it in my drawing. It helps me make more accurate comparisons as I go. And with a drawing this size, it's so tiny, it's a real challenge to make sure that everything is accurate. So to help with that, it's really important to make sure you have a very sharp point on your pencil as you're drawing. That way the width of your line is very small, and it just lets you be a little bit more precise. The more careful you are, the more accurate this drawing is going to turn out. Our goal is for this to be as photorealistic as possible. And with something as small as a 3x3, even the tiniest and most subtle change or shift in your line can make a really big difference in the overall success of your drawing. So I'm beginning to move into another square, and again, just continuously looking at the relationship of the resource picture to the grid. In my mind, as I'm drawing, I'm trying very hard to not think about what it is I'm actually drawing as being an object. So in my head, I'm trying not to think I'm drawing a shoe or a foot or a carpet or my leg. Instead, I'm thinking about everything in relation to the visual input that my brain is seeing in the resource picture. And that sounds really weird, but let me explain that. I'm thinking about lines, I'm thinking about edges. Where is this line in reference to this line? Where do things intersect? Does it curve up? Does it curve down? Is it straight? Is it diagonal? By forcing my brain to think about the drawing in this way as just lines and shapes and edges and not what it actually is, it doesn't matter what I'm drawing. As long as I draw the lines in the correct place, it's going to end up looking like the thing it's intended to be in the very end. And this is a way of helping your brain transition from left brain function over to the right brain function, which is where your mind is able to replicate visual input of information rather than thinking about the idea of what that object should look like. You always hear people say, draw what you see and not what you think you see. And that's that whole transition over to the right brain thinking. One of the things that I think is really great about learning to draw is that you don't have to learn how to draw everything specifically and individually. You'll see a ton of tutorials online where it's learn how to draw a flower, learn how to draw a tree. But none of that really matters as long as you're learning to see and use that right brain function. That's all you need to know, because then you can apply that to literally anything in the world and be able to draw it, because you'll be able to use your artistic problem solving and thinking skills to draw it no matter what it is, because everything in the world can be broken down into those basic elements of art: line, shape, color, texture, value, space, and form. If you understand those elements, you can begin to really understand the world around you and create some really high-level, impactful artwork. Now as I get ready to start shading, I'm going to erase the grid in the area that I'm starting to work on. And I like to think of shading as just value without really thinking about what it is I'm drawing. I'm just looking at value and texture. So replicating that, thinking, what is this particular area? Is it darker, lighter? How does it fade? What's that value relationship from one area to the next? Don't get too bogged down by, again, what it is you're trying to shade, but just think of it as with a value structure. I also like to think about values on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being white and 10 being black. And I think about the value of an area as I'm working on it as well. Once I have that base value down, I'm going to go through and add some of the more subtle details of the carpet. There are little tiny splotches and speckles of darker areas just coming from the texture, and I'm just going to replicate that really generally, just where I see them, make some little marks. Then I'm going to go through with my mechanical pencil because I can get a much more defined and hard edge for the shoe and start looking at the value comparison between the shoe and the carpet. There's a pretty big contrast in value there, and I want to make sure that I get that so that way everything really stands out and is very visible to the viewer. If you don't have good contrast in your picture, everything will look sort of muddled and too soft. And where you have a hard edge with a big contrast, you really want to make sure things stand out and have a good visual punch. So once I have a base value filled in on this shoe, I'm going to start looking at more subtle detail. In general, the shoe's about a value 6, but I notice that the left side starts to fall into shadow because the light source is coming from the right, so I'm going to push that area a little bit darker. Now, one of the things that's really going to make your image come to life is the amount of detail that you notice as you're drawing it. The more accurate and the more comparisons you make and that you see, the more realistic your drawing is going to look. The subtlest and most tiny details can make a big difference, but I always like to put in the general value first and then refine and hone in on more subtle details. So the more I look, the more sort of detail I see in this drawing as I go. I kind of keep moving around that whole area, looking at the relationship of the shoe to the carpet to my skin tone, and really looking at the relationship between those things. Is it a soft edge, in which case I want the shading to transition subtly and smoothly and very gradually, or is it a hard edge where I want things to be really sharp and defined? Noticing those types of differences and the differences in texture. Is it something that's very, very smooth, or is it something that's splotchy and textured? You know, you could be drawing something like grass, in which case you might need really distinctive types of pencil marks, or leaves in a tree. Let your shading marks replicate the type of texture that you're trying to create. As you're working, just keep in your mind, what am I seeing? What's the value relationship and what are the textures? And just keep going and keep pushing yourself. This is something that's great to do while you're listening to music or have the TV playing in the background. I like to sort of just tune out and kind of get lost in my work, and having something I can listen to really helps me do that. Once the shading of my drawing is finished, I'm going to go through and add my artist signature, a title, and the date. For your artist signature, make sure you use your first and last name. That way I can keep up with who each drawing belongs to. And do this in pencil first, and then go over top of it in pen. That way you can make sure that everything fits nicely the way that you want to in this. Then once the pen is completely dry, you can go over top of it with an eraser and erase the original pencil marks. The very last thing that I'm going to do is outline my drawing in black pen. The pen that I'm using tends to smear really easily, so I'm being very careful to lift the ruler rather than slide the ruler to make sure I don't accidentally smudge anything. But once you've finished this, you can then cut your picture out very carefully if you would like, or you can leave it on the bigger page, and I'll be happy to cut it out for you on the paper cutter at school. So there's my drawing from start to finish to give you an example of what to do with your own. Here's my finished product, and I wish you all good luck as you begin to create your own miniature drawings.